Welcome to the Level 2 training module for TOR Requirement 2, Hierarchy of Responsible Management Strategies, which explains the fundamentals of this section in greater detail. While the intention of this training module is to increase understanding of R2 requirements, it is not intended to be used as a standalone guide. For the official text of all R2 requirements, download the R2 v3 standard from the SERI website. The general principle of Core 2 is to develop and adhere to a policy for managing used and end-of-life electronic equipment, components, and materials that is based on a hierarchy of responsible management strategies, prioritizing reuse first, followed by materials recovery for recycling into new products. There are two main elements in Core Requirement 2. First, an R2 facility must develop a written policy that addresses how it manages used and end-of-life electronic equipment, components, and materials that is based on a hierarchy of responsible management strategies. This policy should describe how the facility intends to ensure potentially reusable equipment and components will be directed to reuse whenever practical. The second main element of Core 2 is evaluating and sorting all equipment, components, and materials in accordance with that policy and the requirements in Core 6, sorting, categorization, and processing. The evaluation and sorting process should follow the three-tier order of preference: reuse, followed by materials recovery, and finally disposal, only in rare circumstances where no viable reuse or recovery options exist. Let's examine each tier of the hierarchy in more detail. Reuse is a foundational principle of the R2 standard and takes precedence in the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. All electronic equipment, components, or materials entering the control of an R2 facility must be evaluated for reuse potential. Reuse considerations should include the physical condition, functionality, and value of items in the destination market. The requirements in Core 6, sorting, categorization, and processing, are essential to this evaluation process in determining the appropriate reuse path. Potentially reusable items can be processed internally by the facility, but only if the facility is qualified to process those items according to the applicable requirements, certified to Appendix C for test and repair, or certified to Appendix D for specialty electronics reuse, or for small amounts of specialty or collectible equipment in conformance to the 1% rule in Core 6E. If a facility does not meet the requirements to process reusable items internally, those items can be processed by a downstream refurbisher that has been verified according to the downstream recycling chain requirements in Appendix A. It's important to note that any equipment, components, and materials that are not legal to sell cannot be reused. Such items include equipment that is lost, stolen, counterfeit, or recalled, and equipment cannot be reused if the supplier contractually requires materials recovery. In all such cases, these materials must be directed to materials recovery and never reuse. The second tier in the hierarchy of responsible management strategies is materials recovery. This is what many think of when they talk about electronics recycling. Materials recovery includes everything from manual dismantling to high-tech mechanical, chemical, or thermal processing methods. For anything sorted, evaluated, and categorized as not capable of reuse, an R2 facility must direct those items to a materials recovery process meeting the R2 standard for recycling. An R2 facility has two options at this point. They can either process the materials themselves if they're certified to Appendix E, Materials Recovery, or transfer the material to a downstream vendor that has been verified according to the requirements of Appendix A, Downstream Recycling Chain. By following one of these two options, the R2 facility guarantees that any materials categorized for materials recovery will be handled responsibly, and that all focus materials, those materials that require extra care during processing, will be processed according to R2 requirements. The third and final tier of the hierarchy of responsible management strategies is disposal, which is defined in the R2 standard as energy recovery, incineration, or land disposal. Disposal is only to be used as a last resort when reuse or materials recovery options are not possible or practical. The requirements regarding disposal are separated into two categories: disposal of focus materials and non-focus materials. Focus materials are the materials and electronics that require greater care and safeguards due to their toxicity and potential risks to workers, the public, and the environment. They include batteries, circuit boards, CRT glass, mercury, and polychlorinated biphenyls, also referred to as PCBs. Core 2 prohibits the disposal of focused materials, or equipment and components containing focused materials, unless it is specifically required by law. For example, if applicable law requires the use of a specific technology to dispose of materials, such as incineration of PCBs. The only other exception to the prohibition on disposal is in the case of rare and extreme circumstances beyond the control of an R2 facility. Examples of this could include an event that disrupts the normal management of a focused material, such as a flood in a major processor that prevents the market's ability to process that certain focused material, or a fire at an R2 facility that causes the electronics on site to become part of a remediation effort as a result of damage and contamination. In such cases, a facility may consider using energy recovery, incineration, or land disposal on a temporary basis until normal management is again possible. It's important to keep in mind, however, that disposal in such cases must always be in accordance with legal requirements. Core 2 also addresses disposal of non-focused materials. Facilities are required to take all practical steps to reuse or recycle whenever possible. Disposal is not permitted unless all other reuse or materials recovery options have been exhausted and there are no technically viable recycling processes available. In such cases of last resort, the facility must determine the most environmentally beneficial option of energy recovery, incineration, or land disposal. One other thing to note, cost alone is never an acceptable reason for resorting to disposal. The three levels of the hierarchy of responsible management strategies should guide an R2 facility through their process of evaluation and sorting of all electronic equipment, components, and materials. Reuse first, followed by materials recovery, and finally disposal only in rare circumstances where no other practical reuse or recovery options exist. For more information about the R2v3 standard, visit the R2 Knowledge Base on the SERI website.